So we are very fortunate to have with us today Judy Pinnolis. Judy is Associate Director of Library at the Berklee College of Music and Boston Conservatory. She is adjunct faculty at Hebrew College teaching Jewish musicology. She is creator of the Jewish Music Web Center, past chair of the Jewish Music Roundtable of Music Library Association, and the president of the New England chapter of the American Association of College and Research Libraries, and the author of numerous articles and encyclopedia entries. Good to have you with us, Judy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So in our last program, we looked at an earlier period from antiquity until the early modern period, and we investigated the roles that Jewish women played or were not allowed to play in music. So I'm interested in exploring with you how change came about.
Well, as you know, when Jews came to the United States and they brought their Yiddish culture with them, one of the things that happened is that women were singers in the light opera or operettas, if you will, that became Yiddish theater and songs that were added. And it was very interesting that one of the things that happened is you very frequently saw women singing liturgical music on the stage in the Yiddish theater, or semi-liturgical music or quasi-liturgical music, sacred songs in the course of the act or the storyline of these Yiddish theater productions. And so you got an American audience who became more used to seeing women singing this kind of music, singing words and text with Hebrew, singing it with Yiddish, and singing these sacred kinds of music. And then you see that this kind of music, where women are on the stage and doing performance of sacred music, it becomes carried over into a kind of performance for other venues. So when Jews go to recreational areas or later the Catskills and other things, in those kinds of settings, women started performing music. It was entertainment, and the entertainment was chazanut. And they frequently were the daughters, again, the daughters of cantors who could not sing in the synagogue for the whole community, but sang these kinds of songs as in entertainment venues, whether it's the Yiddish theater stage or later other types of venues. And we see what happens in the 20th century is that with this technology that comes about, radio and recording, the cylinders, and then later, of course, LPs, that they produce this music and record it. And one of the things you see about the chazentes is that they imitate the male voice as much as possible. They lower their voice, they use the deeper registers, and they are producing the popular chazanut sound of the day, which at that period of time is what we call the golden age of chazanut in the
So they're not
United
just
States.
singing in their own register, they're actually singing an octave lower in some cases in the tenor register to make it almost indiscernible from an actual tenor chazan. And I'll bet you have some wonderful examples for us.
We do have, what's amazing is that we do have wonderful examples, both actually of some Yiddish theater singers who sing liturgical or quasi-liturgical songs. And we have recordings, of course, of the chazentes who were much, at a little bit later time period. So we're talking radio in the 30s and 1930s, 1940s, which of course is a modern period. So we have Lady Cantor, Madame Sophie Kurtzer, and she was born in the 19th century, but performed in the early 20th century. Bernice Kanefsky Hausman, who called herself Bosheva, and Jean Gornish, who was known as Chandela de Chazente, Perla Feig, known as the Hungarian Chazente, Goldie Malowski, and Frady Oiser. Okay, so I have today an example of a Kadusha sung by Perla Fay. And she had a very lower voice. She wore a cantorial garb, that is, at the time, the taller hat, hat, Kazan hat, and she wore robes to look like a cantor. But of course, she wasn't an ordained cantor, and she sang only in performance venues. Well, then we have Jean Garner. She was born in 1915, and she called herself Chandela de Chazentes. We're going to hear a Nenu by her. She was born in Philadelphia, and we know about her that she made up her mind very early on in her life to sing cantoral music. In 1936, she started using this title chazente, and she started singing in the late 1930s, around 1937 is the earliest that I know about, on radio in Philadelphia. She was an alto, and she was also in commercials and so on. She did the usual radio things where people did singing and they did some commercials. She did a real shift in the late 30s, starting to call herself the Chandela de Chazentes, the world's only woman's cantor. That was her advertising, but of course she wasn't. She appeared with other cantors in many times types of cantorial programs and entertainment venues and so on. So she had a great fan club at the time. And eventually we see that she does those kinds of tours, seders, and going where people would go to large venues or holiday venues or hotels for a big seders and the like, and she did that. She also assisted cantors with high holidays and things like that at these kinds of venues, but she was not ordained or in a synagogue with her singing.
So,
Well, as you know, Frady Oiser was the sister of Moshe Oiser, one of the most famous cantors of the golden age of chazanut. And he also was a movie star. Frady, who was born actually in Bessarabia, part of then the Russia Empire, and she was born in 1913 and lived to 2003. So she died at the age of 90. She also was the daughter of a cantor and sang with the father in the synagogue. They were tutored in the chants in the synagogue, but that did not mean she sang in the synagogue during services. She learned everything and she sang everything, but she didn't sing it for services. She began her career as really a child actress in Yiddish theaters. And, in all the New York venues, I guess it was called the Second Avenue kinds of areas there. And she became famous for all her roles. And she became one of those women who began singing cantoral music on the stage. One of the interesting things about Frady is that she toured very widely throughout the United States and even abroad, performing cantoral music and theater songs, liturgical chants. It was all part of the same kinds of thing. Part of the show is all mixed in together. And so they were in the circuit, so to speak. Her daughter is Marilyn Michaels, and who is also a well-known artist. We're going to hear Frady singing Sim Shalom, which is a very interesting version of this, and I think you'll really like it.
Sim Shalom, Sim Shalom, Toivo Uvracha, Hein Vachesed, V'rachamim Aleinu, Toivo Uvracha, Hein Vachesed, V'rachamim Aleinu, Ve'al Kol Yisrael, Yisrael, V'toy bayer chol vor chasam choyis roel.
Also born in 1920s, in 1925 was Bernice Konevsky, who married Hausman and became Bernice Konevsky Hausman. And she gave herself the stage name Bosheva. And one of the things that's really interesting about her, she came from a wealthy Jewish family in Philadelphia and decided to go into show business. The stage name was so the name would not be associated with her family initially, until I guess she got established, what have you. And she did the whole Borscht Belt, Catskill Mountain performance thing. She starred in a program called Soul of a People. She was a really popular Catskill popular singer. She sang kind of in the style of Judy Garland, if you will. That was the time in the 1950s. And you'll hear in the sound recording I have, it's really definitely set in the 1950s because you have the orchestration is a very large orchestration.
Should we call it schmaltzy?
Today we might think of that. At the time, people loved it. They loved the idea of dressing up the music and making it bigger, more like a movie background music and stuff like that. So this is entertainment music. An interesting thing that I found out from Henry Saposnik. He gave a talk on an African-American woman who was in the circuit in the 1920s doing the cantorial music. And she called herself the Black Chazente. And her name was Goldie Steiner. I don't know whether she was Jewish or not. There are a lot of stories about her origins, where she came from. There were a lot of things that were made up kind of as advertising about her background, whether she came from Ethiopia, was an Ethiopian Jew. That was probably not true, but nevertheless, she was part of this sort of scene of chazentes where she did cantoral music and sang for audiences at in performance venues in New York. A very interesting thing to learn about.
Fascinating. Well,
Yeah.
let's move on to the next chapter where we see women officiating as cantors in a synagogue in a liturgical basis, although not accepted officially by the establishment. So, what brought about this change? And tell us about that, please.
Well, the first evidence that I have learned about in the United States of a woman actually serving as a cantor in synagogue during services and acting in the role of a cantor is Julie Eichberg Roswald. And this is in the 1800s. So she was born in Stuttgart in 1847. Her father was a cantor. Moritz Eichberg was a famous cantor there. Her uncles were cantors, and her grandfather was a cantor. So she comes from a long line and a large family of musicians and cantors. She came to the United States and became an opera singer and an opera star and traveled throughout the United States singing opera and was quite famous and quite wealthy from her singing. And she had a terrific career. But in 1884, she and her husband, primarily due to his health, decided to go to California and leave the operas. There were a lot of operas that were traveling operas companies that she was with. And when she came, within a few months of having arrived in San Francisco, the Temple Emmanuel there asked her to preside and to lead the services because the local cantor had passed away suddenly. And she did. And they decided to keep her on as the cantor for their synagogue for 9 years. So between 1884 and 1893, she was called cantor soprano and was doing all the things that cantors do, singing in the services as the solo, singing and leading the services. She chose the music. She directed the choir. Women singing in choirs was an accepted role in many synagogues and in many Jewish communities, not just Reform. Now, there were also soloists. One of the things that's not widely understood is that there were sometimes Christian women who were brought in as a soloist in a synagogue setting in the United States. There were also organists. Many of the organists in Europe were women. Jewish women were organists in the 19th century and early 20th century. And the other thing you have to remember is that in the United States in the early days, it was difficult for Jewish communities to get trained leadership into their community, to get them to come from Europe. So you see a lot of people taking on roles that would possibly not have been the case had there been, the way to train people and have more trained people coming in. However, you get people like Julie Roswald, who had been trained in her father, sitting at her father's knee, so to speak, where he had a school and she could hear everything that was going on, and she learned classical Southern German chazanut, and she was very well versed in Hebrew and so on. You see here the beginnings of these kinds of roles for women being accepted as community leaders, as singing at important events under the auspices of synagogues.
All right, next chapter, Judy, is Jewish women cantors being formally accepted by the establishment. When and how does that come about?
But, I see this as a process that started as early as the 1950s. A woman by the name of Betty Robbins, who was actually born in Greece and came to the United States, becomes the first woman accepted into her synagogue in modern times as a female cantor. Now, she's not ordained by a formal school, but she was definitely considered the cantor of the synagogue that was at Temple Avodah in Oceanside, New York. And Betty Robbins really kind of led the way. And she, at the time, she thought she was the first woman cantor in Jewish history, but of course, she just, it was lost to history at that point in time that there had been these women singers before. And then we began to see that women are accepted into cantorial schools, which had been many of them kind of established right after World War II, where the Jewish community starts taking on the, many more roles and responsibilities in world Jewry. The establishment of the cantorial schools after the destruction of European Jewry and institutions. But increasingly, they started allowing women to become educated as teachers and so on, but they were not granted ordination, but they were getting degrees. And then we see in the 1970s that Barbara Osfeld applies to Hebrew Union College in New York to become the first woman to be granted not only a degree, but get ordained. And she was accepted and she was ordained and she was given, sent out to a post and has had an illustrious career as a Reformed cantor.
I'm sure this was controversial, the idea of these seminaries, the Reform and Conservative seminaries in New York, accepting women students and then accepting them for ordination.
That's correct. I mean, there was a lot of discussion and it was a process, but again, when Barbara Osfeld became ordained, then immediately, of course, the question opened up whether the other liberal movements were going to also have women as cantors. And amazingly, they had women rabbis before they had women cantors. And I think that's an important point to note, that singing had its own special set of, and leading in prayer by singing had its own sort of set of restrictions that was stricter than teaching or being a rabbi. What we see happening, say, for the conservative movement is that there are some unofficial women performing in sort of unofficial roles, if you will. They are not ordained, but they become cantors in synagogues the way that Betty Robbins did. You see Linda Rich, who grew up in an Orthodox family and comes from a long line of cantors again. Her father was a cantor. She is a fifth generation cantor, and her daughter makes a sixth generation cantor. But at the time, when she was first becoming or serving as a cantor as early as 1978, which is not that much longer after the reform, but she was not ordained. It was not until much later that she was awarded a diploma as chazan, and that was not until 1996. However, she served in congregations all that time. So she was serving as a cantor in a conservative synagogue, but not as an ordained cantor for a long time. By the time women are being granted ordination and, in the 1970s for reform and not until 1980s for the conservative movement, these women, the two women who were first ordained in the conservative movement, Erica Lippitz and Marla Rosenfeld Barugel, they were permitted to prepare for being a chazan. And it was, took quite a number of famous cantors supporting that to happen. And eventually that did happen, and they were ordained in 1987. And it was very, very controversial in the conservative movement. But you did have the support of many conservative cantors, men, established cantors, who championed the role of women to have that change happen in the conservative movement. And it was in 1990 that the Cantors Assembly formally admitted female cantors into their organization. So, right, so you can see these massive changes have come about. The first woman in the Reconstructionist movement, or Reconstructing Judaism, I guess it's called today, was Sharon Hordes. She was trained at Gratz College and at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. And she was not ordained as a cantor until 2002.
Let's go on from there to what it sounds like. So it seems to me that Jewish women cantors today are making a unique contribution. They are not simply singing the traditional cantorial repertoire in a different octave. They are not simply singing nusach, but I think they're creating a new repertoire and a new performance style that these women uniquely have innovated and cultivated.
And this is one of the things that's been so remarkable, is so many of the women becoming not only the singers of Israel, but the composers of new song for Jewish liturgical music. And the massive shift in music that has happened in the last 25 to 30 years, which is primarily American, more popular, and away from traditional chazanut.
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable unto you, O
I think that one of the things that we're seeing with women becoming the sort of singer-songwriters, if you will, is following on a trend that happened starting really in the 1960s and 70s of bringing folk music into the synagogue, American folk music. You had Debbie Friedman, of course, being the most famous case. She was not a cantor, but later in life, she did study more cantorial music with Jack Mendelson and others. What you see also is this trend towards more popular American-based genre type music and changing the atmosphere, the style, the way that the liturgy is understood in music. The other thing that's happening is a movement in some of the liberal movements of bringing in instruments into the synagogue again. Instrumentation is changing to reflect bringing in cultural aspects from other traditions. One of those has been a rabbi. She's a cantor and a rabbi, Shefa Gold. And she has written many, many pieces of music. And the style of her music brings in traditions or chanting, if you will, not traditional Jewish chant, but chanting brought in from the style of it comes from other traditions. And these other traditions are blending and being blended with some traditional sounds and being blended with Jewish liturgical texts. So that's a very interesting change that you see. Others are bringing in aspects of American popular culture, such as American folk music, or more Broadway sounds, if you will, or more pop musical sounds to worship. So one thing, Josh, that's kind of interesting today, as you know, we started out with women not being allowed to lead prayer in synagogue. And today, possibly more women than men are being ordained as cantors in the United States in the liberal movements. And when I say liberal movements, of course, because women are not being ordained or leading services in Orthodox synagogues in terms of mixed services. But one of the things that I have come across, and I attended one of these, was some Orthodox synagogues have separate services where women are leading the prayer in their own room or section of a synagogue, and it's an all women's minyan, if you will. And it's uh, a very interesting development because women know this. If they know the music, they know how to lead services, they know the Hebrew, they are well educated, and they have the desire to do that. So today you have all sorts of things happening, and women doing paraliturgical music on recording in Orthodox settings
I'm going to
for
jump in
women
here.
only.
Yes, this is happening in many, shall we say, modern Orthodox synagogues, the separate women's service. And then parallel to that is another phenomenon of Orthodox women entertainers or performers who will perform with only women in the audience.
I guess one of the takeaways I'd hope that people will remember is that women have all along been participating, but that it has changed over the years. But today we can say that women have altered the way that prayer is heard and received by their voices and by their creative energies that have gone into interpreting the liturgy. And I'm sure that that will continue in the future.
Judy, this has been great. What a wealth of information that you have brought to us. I have learned
Thank
so
you.
much today, and I'm sure our audience has also. Thank you so much for being with us.
You're very welcome anytime.